I'm Leslie Elliott Boyce, and this is The Radical Center, a recording project I began in 2022 as a way to describe and discuss the social and ideological currents that are rapidly altering our culture. In a time when political polarization seems to be the norm, I'm seeking to understand rather than react. I'm grateful to all the thoughtful men and women who share their stories and insights with me in this conversation series. If you would like to contribute to this project financially, there are links in the description. Thank you, and thank you all for listening and being part of this exploration. Today I'm speaking with Will Hall, and Will, you're the host of Madness Radio, and that's how I found you. And I've listened to so many of your podcast episodes now, and I've gleaned a lot from the work that you're doing. And would you mind maybe just starting by saying a little bit about yourself and your background and what got you involved in the work that you're doing around psychiatric survival and involuntary psychiatric treatment? I'm really fascinated.
Yeah, thank you, Leslie, so much for the invitation and for the opportunity to talk with you today. And yeah, I was really drafted into this work. I was conscripted. I had no idea what the mental health system was all about until in my mid-20s. An accumulation of all kinds of stresses and difficulties that I had no ability, and the people around me had no ability to respond to and help me with. That accumulation just really hit a breaking point, and I went into a very deep altered state that got called psychosis and got called a symptom of schizophrenia. And then I was diagnosed with a kind of schizophrenia called schizoaffective disorder, schizophrenia. And I'm very cautious about the language because when I went into the system, which was not by choice, they told me that we have to lock you up for your own good. There was so much that was told to me that I had to later unlearn. That the psychiatric field, the research into schizophrenia treatments, medications, diagnosis, this has always been extremely contested and controversial, and there's always been big conflicts driven a lot by political and economic interests. None of that was explained to me. I was just brought into the system, and this is who you are now. We've discovered that you have, just like someone has tuberculosis or a tooth infection. We just discovered this thing about you that now we're going to fix. And the treatments that I was offered, the involuntary hospitalization, the medication, all the different therapy from that perspective really not only didn't help, but made things worse. So I came out of the system in a worse state than I was in. And then really my own process of healing and recovery and getting my life back together has been to question what I was told and what really is the prevailing dominant pharmaceutical industry driven narrative about not just schizophrenia and psychosis, but all mental disorders. So as part of that process, I started a radio show. I started a support group and human rights group in Northampton, Massachusetts, and everything was very small scale to begin with, but we found that there were a lot of people who shared this perspective and had nowhere to go. It was just a complete media blackout, no funding, no representation, no visibility, no welcoming our perspective. And because it was so needed, the work just started growing. And all that experience in support groups and then our community work, I started to get invited to do talks and trainings. And then that slowly, gradually, over many years, brought me to where I am now as a therapist and a trainer, teacher, and a community development worker. And now I'm a researcher. I'm doing my PhD at Maastricht University. So I'm involved in a lot of different efforts to really transform the way that we respond to emotional distress, altered states of consciousness, extreme extreme psychic states. The language is really something that we need to question, because the root problem that I see is power, the power of one person to define the experience of another. You are this. Let me tell you what your truth is. Let me tell you what your reality means. Let me tell you how you should live your life. And the work that I do steps back from that. I never would tell somebody what they should or should not do in terms of understanding their own experience. I try and accompany them. The support groups that we work with, the Hearing Voices movement, we accompany people in their own process of discovery and learning, which is really how informed consent and human rights-based medicine should be. You collaborate with the patients, helping them make their own decisions. So when people hear that I'm critical of psychiatry, that I don't believe in the diagnosis of schizophrenia, I was on disability for 15 years. I got a disability check for 15 years, but I don't take medications. People make a lot of assumptions that that I embrace the idea of anti-psychiatry, that I'm against medication. I really have a harm reduction approach, which means that every person is going to be different. And just like I wouldn't assume that, someone's choices are wrong about alcohol or substances, or how they want to manage their life and their relationships, or their stressful job. I really want to meet people where they're at with their choices around medications and treatments. So I'm not anti-medication. I'm not pro-medication. But at the same time, there's a huge part of the story that we have not been told about the harms and risks, and also the alternatives to medications, hospitals, diagnosis, and the whole mental health treatment. So, yeah, I mean, a podcast is a big part of what I do. I also have some writing that I've done, and I'm very involved with community work and teaching and trying. Fortunately, there's a lot of change happening in the system now, especially the younger residents and nurses in training are very interested in different perspectives. So that would start to scratch the surface. I mean, I guess I've been doing this work for maybe more than 20 years now, I think,
Oh,
something like
wow.
that. Yeah.
Yeah. So it was a really profound experience for you as a young person going through that and having that label
Mm-hmm.
applied to you and losing agency as you were
Mm-hmm.
involuntarily subjected to the treatments that were deemed to be
Mm-hmm.
appropriate. And I think, I think I found your podcast after I listened to the audiobook, Mad in America, Robert Whitaker. A
Mm-hmm.
friend of mine
Mm-hmm.
recommended
Mm-hmm.
it. And I studied psychology in undergrad, and then I went to graduate school to study counseling. And when you study psychology, there's always they always go into the history of the asylums and how insanity has been viewed over the ages and treated over the ages. And there's this sort of sense that, okay, that's how we used to do it, but we do it right now. But
Mm-hmm.
with the power of the diagnostic label, having the person applying that label, depending on what it is, you find that people are still forfeiting their own agency and their own will based on someone else's assessment of them in many cases. And that's it's not really a thing of the past. It's still happening. You refer to it as a moral emergency, I think, in one of your talks.
Yeah, the moral emergency is really the way in which we've normalized violence. And if I talk about a moral emergency in psychiatry, and I say that basically what we're doing is um, uh, uh, kidnapping people, assaulting them, torturing them, poisoning them, and killing them systematically in the name of care, people are quite shocked about that. They think, well, how is it that
Mhm.
a healing profession, the science-based healing profession, could be doing this? And I would say we don't have to look very far in history. Up until the early 80s, actually up until the 90s, in some countries, being gay was considered a mental disease.
Mhm.
And people were routinely, just because they were LGBTQ, they were routinely kidnapped, assaulted, tortured, and killed in hospitals, often in unmarked graves. They were driven out of their families. They were erased, their identities based just for being who they are, based on a false belief that it was a disease. And the people think that, well, okay, the science has progressed since then.
Mhm.
And there's a kind of an impression that, well, by the 80s, they were doing research and there was like the Kinsey report, and they started to think, well, actually, maybe being gay is not, it's not a majority experience, but it's a normal experience. It's a normal minority variation in what it is to be human. There's nothing pathological about it at all. People think that that was sort of discovered because the science gave itself an upgrade. It's not what happened at all. What happened was the Stonewall Rebellion. What happened was the gay liberation movement. What happened was people throwing bricks at police cars and turning them over and setting them on fire and then marching. After the Stonewall Rebellion, there were dozens and dozens of gay liberation groups that were formed all over the country. And psychiatry was forced politically to change its position. And you say, well, wait a second, how can politics be influencing science so much? Well, actually, if you look at the way that psychiatry works, it's all politics. It's 100% politics. The every year, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is kind of like the yellow pages of madness, and some people have compared it to the hammer of witches, the Malus Maleficarum, which the witch hunters would use to kind of look up which kind of witchcraft they were going to be persecuting. Every year that grows in size, not because of the emerging scientific consensus, but literally because there are committee meetings where people vote and there are political debates and there's a tremendous amount of money and careers at stake in this. So when I say that we're talking about normalized violence, it's shocking, but it actually is consistent with psychiatry's history. The situation right now with hearing voices, for example, is a really clear example. When I was in the hospital, they would come in and they would say, "Will, are you hearing voices today?" And I would say, "Well," I would start to say, "Yeah, I have this experience where there's this something, some kind of entity or being that is in my head. It's telling me things," and they would just check the box. There was never any question or curiosity. They just checked the box because hearing voices considered a clinical criteria for psychosis and schizophrenia. Just like having homosexual desires was considered a clinical criteria of the mental disease of homophobia, of homosexuality. But this is just homophobia. And we have just the same kind of bigotry towards altered states, but we still haven't had the political struggle to overturn that bigotry. So actually some of the political struggle is happening on the level of researchers, because there are people like me who've been patients in the systems who then move into being researchers. And there's also been the community organizing. So the Hearing Voices movement has been pushing research that actually goes into the community and goes into history. And turns out that most people who hear voices don't have a problem with it. In fact, I'm sure that many listeners right now who definitely they hear the voice of God after they were grieving. They might have heard the voice of a loved one. Many poets and artists hear voices as part of their an experience that's called the muse. So the problem really isn't hearing voices. The problem is when you hear voices and it causes difficulties, when it causes you distress, when you're overwhelmed by it or it's harmful for you in some way. But back in the hospital, there was none of that. There was just, are you hearing voices? Check. And therefore now you're on the other side of this line. You're one of them. And that's what we do with altered states of consciousness. And we have an incredible fear response. It's now very common for police when they hear that someone is suicidal. In the US, the police are so militarized and they're mostly bored because all the scares and all the fear doesn't materialize. Police are mostly just driving around and talking to people in the community. There's not like a lot of action. It's not like a Hollywood action film being a police officer usually. And so when they hear that someone is suicidal, they're amped up and they think, okay, this person is armed. And so he's going to be dangerous. So he could hurt the people around him, rather than understanding that someone who's suicidal wants to kill themselves. They want to harm themselves. And then the reaction is so fear-based and so exaggerated that people end up getting killed routinely just because they're suicidal. Someone is hearing voices, the police come, they will assume that they're dangerous.
Mhm.
And then in addition to that, initial kind of contact with the system, people putting people in restraints. I was put in restraints
Mhm.
to transport me to the hospital. Now, because you have that, you're on the other side of the line, you're assumed to not be qualified to make your own decisions. It's basically a way of
Right.
disqualifying. I have a thought disorder called schizophrenia. Now I can't even trust my own thinking
Mhm.
to help me. How am I going to figure out how can I? It's just such an incredibly um, destructive. It robs you of your own resources. And then here comes psychiatry that says, okay, well, I'm going to do your thinking for you. I'm
Mhm.
going to give you these medications because we have to give you these medications. If you don't want to take these medications, well, it's a symptom of your lack of insight into your illness, even though the medications are quite horrific in their side effects up to and including premature death. They can be quite toxic
Mhm.
for people. So we systematically respond with fear and violence. We force people into the hospital. And then people say, well, Will, people are clearly in distress. There's disturbances happening in the community. Well, yeah, if there's not a crime going on,
Mhm.
then maybe we should just learn to live with weirdness, live with difference, live with people being unusual. Someone is suicidal doesn't need that need that we need to doesn't mean that we need to call the police. Maybe we need to start having our community resources to respond. Maybe we need to have non-police supports, community-based, voluntary-based supports. But we don't do that. We use violence, and we create a double standard that I have the right to be free in the community until the police officer looks on my record and sees that I have a psychiatric diagnosis of psychosis. Now, when I'm stopped because I forgot to fix my taillight or something, and I'm upset and scared, and the police officer is interacting with me, and I react, they see that I have that label, and now suddenly they just grab me. And there's no charge of a crime. There's no justification, but the perception is that this person is off their meds, or this person is um, dangerous, or they can't take care of themselves. And so I don't have the equal rights to be in the community. I live in fear of this. I live in fear of having an interaction with the police
Mhm.
go wrong. And then now I'm in a hospital and I seem pretty calm right now, but you put me back in interacting with the police or being in a hospital, I'm going to start to escalate and I'm going to possibly go into an altered state. So the disability rights movement has been saying just because you have a disability, just because you're different, doesn't mean you lose your rights. And
Mhm.
we used to put people with disabilities, if you're blind or you're deaf or you have Down syndrome, we would force them to just be in institutions.
Mhm.
And we learned with the Olmsted decision and with the rights movement, that's not okay. People have the right to be in the community. They may need supports to be in the community, but they have equal rights. When you have a psychiatric diagnosis, you lose those rights.
Mhm.
You want to lose custody of your children?
Mhm.
Get a bipolar diagnosis, get a
Mhm.
borderline diagnosis, and then your partner just needs to pull that out in
Mhm.
front of the judge, and you better have a really good lawyer because you're going to lose custody of your kids. You want to get insurance coverage, you want to be able to travel. I have a friend in Canada. She's never had any problem with driving on her driving record, but just because she had an altered state and went to the hospital, they've denied her a driver's license.
Mhm.
Think about the legal implications of having one class of citizens that has the right to have a driver's license, which is basic to freedom in a technological capitalist society, right? And then having another class of people just by virtue of the label, not
Mhm.
because she can't drive or she has a history or anything like that. She can't have her drive. These are happen over and over and over again. People in that I work with who have visits by therapists at the community and they monitor their medication. And the person is working with me as a client. They're doing great off of their medication. They're building their life, they're preparing to have children, they're back in the workforce. But because the label is there,
Mhm.
the mental health system, which is basically the state, has said,
Mhm.
no, 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 we get to decide. You don't have the choice to not take your medication. So we're going to come in and monitor And so now the person is living in fear that they're going to find out that they're not taking their medication. So this is a kind of like a shadow reality. It's like an underground reality, the psychiatric survivor experience. And many, many people are harmed. Many, many
Mhm.
people are killed. I don't know if you've listeners who've been on pain medication, for example. I mean, some people, okay, they find pain medication pleasant. Most people don't. You sort of lose touch with yourself. It's a really unpleasant kind of impairment of your personality. Imagine being forced to take that all the time.
Mhm.
And then you tell your doctor, well, I have blurred vision. And the doctor says, oh, it's blurred vision, dry mouth. That's not a problem. Those are just side effects. I can't read because I'm on these medications. Oh, no, that's okay. You just need to stay on the medications. And if you disagree with me, I'm going to, have you losing your ability to read because of a label that you've been given and your choice around that is denied.
Mhm.
So there's so many ways in which we inflict the systematic violence. And so that's why I call it a moral emergency. It's just the same as if we were in 1950 and surrounded by people who were being locked up, tortured, and killed just because they're gay. That's what's happening
Mhm.
today. It's a complicated conversation because people think, well, Bill, people are out there, they're going wild in the streets, they're disrupting, they're walking in traffic. Yes, people need help, but they
Mhm.
need help. They don't need
Mhm.
control and violence. If there are crimes being committed, then we do have a criminal justice system for addressing that, which is also inhumane. We also have to work on fixing our criminal justice system. But the idea that that there's going to be this double standard, that people lose their rights is a moral emergency. And in fact, there is now legal precedent on an international scale. The United Nations developed the Convention on the Rights with People with Disabilities. The U.S. is not a signator
Mhm.
of the convention, which is interesting and maybe not surprising. But the convention says that the mental health system, as it's currently constituted, based on coercion, is a systematic violation of rights. We need to
Mhm.
move towards a voluntary, community-based mental health system. The World Health Organization, for all of its pluses and minuses, is on the right side of this issue. They have said we need to move towards
Mhm.
a community-based, voluntary system. Now, that means that if the person is in an altered state and they are living in the woods and people are worried about them, yeah, you might need to devote some resources. You might need to get some people who can slowly develop a relationship with them, bring them some blankets, bring them juice, hang out with them, bring a guitar, play guitar with them. But none of this going out with police and just grabbing people because they're in altered states. A lot of the people who are kind of the most disturbing and frightening examples, like the people who are on the streets and who are, really acting out and disturbing
Mhm.
people. They have long histories of being violently treated, and they are pushing so-called helpers away because that help has been so intimately connected with violence. So
Mhm.
it's a healthy thing to stay away from helpers who trick you and then commit violence on you. A lot of the people who are on the streets, because we work with a number of people who are homeless in our support groups all the time. There's people who are homeless. I was briefly homeless for a time. And the shelter system can be very dehumanizing. And it's understood in the housing advocacy world that it makes sense why people would want to leave the shelters, why they don't want to go. And if we're going to really respond to homelessness, we
Mhm.
have to improve our shelter system. Same thing with mental health issues. We have to improve the quality of the care. We have to make it voluntary. We have to make it well resourced. One of the best ways that we can do it is start hiring people who've been through it.
Mhm.
Imagine we're trying to deal with drug addiction by hiring people who have just studied it in books.
Mhm.
No, clearly the people who are going to inspire people in their recovery, who are going to be able to really connect with people that, oh, he's just self-destructive. He's just wait till he bottoms out. Well, no, if someone has been through it, they can tell their story, they can build that connection. They have that, wow, we're in this together.
Mhm.
That's what our mental health system needs to be based on. We have to devote the resources to building bridges to altered states, just like we've devoted the resources to elevators, to ramps, towards braille signs, towards walk signs that have sounds that alert people who have visual impairments. We can rebuild our society. It's the richest society in the history of humanity, to include people who have altered states and welcome those experiences, because it's starting to happen around autism.
Mm.
There's starting to be a recognition that, hey, just because someone has autism or is on the spectrum doesn't mean that they can't work. And in fact, having someone who's on the spectrum or who has autism in your workplace, or even on your team, or even in the leadership, they might have a very interesting gift. They might have a very interesting perspective to bring. And I think on the other side of this, think about all the poets and the artists and the healers and the writers and the people that we lost because we just said, "Oh, you're gay. We're gonna kidnap you and throw you in a." Think about all the people who are having altered states, or hearing voices, or seeing visions, or having, wild beliefs, or who are grabbed by intense energies, who all that creative potential, all that sensitivity, all that diversity is lost. So if we start to welcome these experiences, I think we all benefit. And just a quick thought in that vein, if it's really a disease, if it's really something we should get rid of, we have to ask ourselves, from an evolutionary standpoint, why does psychosis and all altered states persist? They're all humans around the world that we've ever studied have altered states and madness and go into these visionary, wild, weird, strange, psychotic. Why is it a built-in feature, not a bug of the species? Well, because maybe it confers something positive. Maybe we need a little bit more madness, because the people who are so-called normal, who are running the show right now, they're driving us over a cliff. We need some new input on this. A lot of people, they discover that maybe they have gifts. I mean, shamans, medicine people, spirit healers in tribal societies. You don't become a shaman because you wake up one day and say, "Oh, I want the nice car. I want the mortgage. I'm going to go to an expensive medical school, and then I'm going to come out and be a doctor just like my family was." No, that's not how you become a shaman. How you become a shaman is you become ill. You become mad. Often it's just like psychosis, or it can even be addiction, or maybe you get struck by lightning or attacked by a wild animal. You have some kind of catastrophe, but it's often a psychotic illness. And then because you are surrounded by elders and a tradition and a cultural frame, it helps you work with those altered states. And then, wow, you have these incredible gifts of bridging to the spiritual world. There are many people now who are successful healers, who are even successful doctors, who are successful therapists, psychotherapists, who are successful teachers, who, if you put them under stress and you give them a test, they're gonna show up schizophrenic, psychotic. They're in the closet with their strange differences, but they're contributing. And so I think that we not only have we done incredible violence to people, and we are in this moral emergency, it's a loss to all of us. It's a loss to all of us.
That's really powerful, and I can relate. I could tell you I'll tell you a couple of vignettes from my own experience. In 2014, I was involuntarily detained for for suicidal ideation. I
Oh, wow.
was
Wow.
The
Wow.
context is the backdrop for that was that I was a new mom. I wasn't new to motherhood, but I had a 6-month-old baby and a 2-year-old son. And I found out it was pretty much one of the worst days of my life. I found out that day that my partner was cheating on me. My husband was cheating on me,
Oh,
and not just cheating on me, but
oh,
I found that he was seeing prostitutes and he had a lot of history in it. I uncovered
yikes.
all of this in one big swoop,
Oh
one
my
big
God.
discovery, and I confronted him with it, and he hit me. And so I had been hit. I had had my life shatter as I knew it. I had called the I had He had left the house. I called and I reported it to the
Mm,
police. So the police had
mm,
come out, taken pictures of my face and taken my
mm,
report. And then that night I was at my darkest. I was in a really, really low state, as you can
Mm,
probably
mm,
imagine somebody would be after they
of
have something
course.
really bad happen in their life. And he was gone, and we were messaging each other back and forth. I was sitting in my driveway. My kids were in the house. My older kids were taking care of the little ones, and my messages to him were of grief and desperation. I couldn't believe that this had happened, and he was scared that I was going to kill myself. So he called, I don't know, 911, or I don't know who he called, but I got a phone call while I'm sitting in my driveway waiting for a friend to come over. A friend was going to come and sit with me. And I got a phone call from some official person, some woman who was kind of cold and dispassionate, and said that she'd gotten a report that I was suicidal. And I said to her I wasn't interested in talking with her. And she probed and probed. And I said, look, I just told him I'd rather die than be a single mother again. And so those were my words. I never said I'm going to kill myself. But then
Mm,
two cops showed up at my house. And I was
mm,
handcuffed and pressed up against
mm,
my car
mm,
for reporting suicidal feelings to my ex-husband, to my husband at the time, not even to their official person.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But they got it got into the system that I was
Yeah,
suicidal. And
yeah,
then
yeah.
I was these men were unkind. They mocked me. I pleaded with them. I have a 6-month-old. I'm breastfeeding. He's exclusively breastfed. You can't take me in. And they said, you should have thought about that before you said what you said.
Oh,
And so it was the
uh.
it was the opposite of help. It was antagonism. I was antagonized by two big men with guns who handcuffed me and pressed me up against a car, and I had to get into an ambulance and be taken across a ferry and into Seattle and into the hospital. And there I was told by the two cops that it was an involuntary 72-hour hold for suicidal threats. Once I got there and I was evaluated by there were a couple
Mm,
of different psychologists or psychiatrists that came in and evaluated me, and they all agreed, you're just having a really terrible day. We're sorry this happened to you. And I was released. I didn't have to stay overnight, thank God. But
mm,
it was an absolutely terrifying moment in my life. It was so
mm,
terrifying that you could set off that kind of cascade just for feeling really sad, just for feeling really, really
mm-hmm,
sad.
mm-hmm,
You could be at the whim of a cold and violent state force. And I thought at
mm-hmm,
that time also, one of the thoughts that I had about that was that we lived in a nice house. We rented just the top floor of this really beautiful house on a hill overlooking the Puget Sound. We were just renting a small part of this house, but if you drove up to it, you'd think, wow, these people are doing pretty well. And so here I
mm-hmm,
am, this, you know, uh, meek and middle class seeming lady.
mm-hmm,
Um,
mm-hmm.
I'm speaking coherently to them. I thought, what if any of these factors weren't here for me? I mean, I would have thought this was this was really shocking. And none of those things protected me. But people who have fewer of those pieces, like you're talking about people who are already seeming a little bit disheveled, or maybe they're homeless, or maybe the dehumanization that I was treated with, I can only imagine would be visited on other
Yeah,
people even more so. And
yeah,
just this was a this made an already devastating event in my life into something that was
yeah.
tremendously challenging for me to overcome. And then I received a $10,000 bill from the hospital a few months
Yeah,
later.
yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
that's,
Thank you, American capitalism.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
exactly.
Wow,
So
wow.
that's one vignette, and that's one way where I really woke up to some of the the
This happens
the
all the
state power.
time. What you're describing
Mhm.
is actually a positive, it's a more positive outcome than a
Because I
lot of
got
the
out.
outcomes because you
Yeah.
got out. Because
Mhm.
there are people that the story is that they're in the hospital and then they start to push you and you get even more extreme, so-called extreme. You start to
Yeah,
fight with them. And then
yeah,
pretty soon you have a bipolar diagnosis. Pretty
yeah,
soon you're forced on drugs and then your life is over. You go down.
yeah.
So I mean, I'm really grateful that you tell this story. It's really powerful. It's really important that people hear this, and we have to understand that this is happening globally. It's
Mhm.
happening over and over again. It's medical tyranny. It's an
Yeah.
absolute. What happened to you was assault
Mhm.
and kidnapping is what
Mhm.
that was. You were brutally, violently assaulted,
Yeah.
and kidnapped. There was
And
no grounds, and there were absolutely all there were
yeah,
many other ways to handle that it
yeah.
could have been a completely different outcome. And it's not to say that some people
Mm-hmm.
don't have positive experiences,
Mm-hmm.
because there's some people do have positive experiences.
Mm-hmm.
They want to be in the hospital. They feel safer. They have good experiences with the
Yeah.
police. But in 1950, some of the people who had homosexual desire also wanted to get treatment. They wanted to get rid of
Mm-hmm.
that. They agreed with the homophobic ideology of
Mm-hmm.
their time. And then also I'm very much pro-choice. I mean, sure, people can have positive experiences,
Mm-hmm.
but even if you choose voluntarily to go in, you have to recognize that this is potentially your
Yeah.
outcome, is that things can turn very dark. Many people who go in, I just want to help, I want to be in the hospital, I want to have a
Mm-hmm.
break, I feel suicidal. You're in, and you were admitted voluntarily. They don't let you out until they
Yeah.
decide. And you're like, wait a second, I was admitted voluntarily. So
To your point,
real,
I
yeah,
felt like I had to really, really work and be at my, I was so scared of what they were going to do
yeah,
to me. And I grew up poor and I had bad experiences with police. We learned to be
mm,
afraid of the cops. When you grow up
mm,
poor,
mm,
poor
hmm,
neighborhoods, they're
hmm,
not, that's not a friendly figure to you. That's a figure of
yeah,
fear,
yeah,
that inspires a lot of fear and anxiety.
mm,
And so this, I was, and to your point about if you fight back, if you say the wrong thing, you could end up getting all these,
mhm,
the cascade goes on. But
exactly.
it took everything because I'm a pretty feisty person and I was furious. But I was more
Yeah,
afraid than I was furious. So I was on my very best
smart.
behavior, very, very
Yeah,
best. And
yeah,
if I had let out my anger and if I had showed
yeah,
them how upset I was about what had happened to me,
yeah,
who knows what could have happened. I was harnessing every bit of
mm,
will that I had to be as proper as
right.
possible and seem like the
Yeah,
model human being in that situation. So
yeah,
yeah, I
yeah,
could very easily see for other people how just being in that spotlight exposes you to
mhm,
potential. And it sounds like that's what happened with you. I've heard you tell your story. I don't know not that you did something that created the cascade, but that once you
mm,
were detained, it just kept getting worse. Like
yeah. I
you
mean, that
maybe said the wrong thing, maybe admitted that you heard a voice or whatever it was, but then the cascade
exactly.
just
I
went
learned
on.
very quickly, and
Mhm.
I frequently am coaching individuals and families. Lie to them, lie to the
Mm,
police, lie to your doctors, lie to the nurses, lie to the interns, lie to the person on 911, lie
mm,
to the dispatcher. Don't say these certain words, because that will
mm,
then be used against you. That is often the message that we get. Our
mm,
approach to suicidal feelings is horrific.
mhm,
Suicidal feelings are a common and normal part of human experience. If you are abused, if you're trapped, if you're shocked, if you're in trauma, if you're going through incredible stress, all the things that were happening for
mhm,
you and for me,
mhm,
feeling like there's got to be a better life, I don't want this life, is
mhm.
a natural, normal,
It's escape.
the
You want to escape it.
absolutely, you want change. You want to
Mhm,
change the life that you're
mhm,
in. Suicidal feelings are normal. Suicide itself is quite rare. Suicidal feelings are quite common. So
mhm,
we treat everyone who has suicidal feelings as if they're going to do it in the next moment. Absolutely not. In fact, what happens is that people learn that if they disclose their suicidal feelings, then there's gonna be medical tyranny. I mean, it's totalitarianism.
mhm,
What you're describing is no different than a scene from George Orwell's 1984. There's no difference. This
mhm,
is a fascist, really totalitarian situation that we're in, where it's corporate power, it's state power fused around, because at the end of the pipeline, there's that $10,000 bill.
mhm,
There's that getting you on medications. So
mhm,
people learn, and I will help them, that you have to choose who you're going to tell what's
mhm,
going on inside of you. And people learn to not talk about their suicidal feelings, which means that they learn to not talk about their feelings, which
mhm,
means that they become isolated, separate, disconnected, which is part of the problem
mhm,
in the first place. So I'm convinced that our response to suicidal feelings with the violence that we're responding to is actually generating suicide. There actually is some research showing that the highest rate of suicide is right after hospital
Mm,
discharge. And so you're traumatizing people, you're adding, and the way in which the police normalize their own violence. I mean, they treat people very, very roughly and very violently and very disrespectfully, and traumatize people, and then
mhm,
just justify it because it's protocol and they're following
mhm,
the letter
mhm.
of their of the training.
Right.
So this is a really important, and it's really important to recognize that people do need help. I mean, you needed help in that moment,
Hmm.
but let's get it from our neighbors. Let's get it from our community. Let's get it from our family. Let's get it from voluntary services, community-based services. Let's do it without diagnosing people and
Hmm.
without, I mean, when someone is homeless and they come in for services, I mean, a lot of people don't have access to services, but if they come into services and they've been homeless over and over again, and they get an apartment or they go into a shelter and then they're back on the streets,
Hmm.
the workers may be frustrated, but they don't diagnose the person with domicile deficiency disorder and then do research on the genetics and the neurochemistry of feeling at home and what is
Hmm.
it that they don't. Or when someone is in intimate partner violence, usually women
Hmm.
being harmed by men, and they come into the shelter and then they go back to the abusive partner. They come into the
Hmm.
shelter and they go back.
Hmm.
It's frustrating, but there's reasons why, and you don't have the the domestic violence worker diagnosing the woman with masochistic personality disorder. You want
Hmm.
to be punished. Well, actually, masochistic personality disorder almost made it into the DSM. It was on
Hmm.
the table. They were going to include it, and it was going to be used against women who
Oh my gosh.
seemingly,
I could see
yeah.
that, even though that's so
Why?
much more complicated than that for
Yeah.
women in
Well,
that situation.
why is it not in the DSM? Why do you not get it? Well, it wasn't because they looked at the research and said this is pseudoscience,
Hmm.
which it is. No, it was feminists. It was activists, people like Paula Kaplan who figured out how to get into those committees and get into the
Hmm.
behind door, closed door, smoky room
Hmm.
conversations. They said this is absolutely, and they pushed back and there was an outcry.
Hmm.
So that's where we're at. I mean, it's very much a political situation. And again, I mean, what complicates the situation is that we don't have alternatives.
Hmm.
So if the media, everything is telling you call 911, 911. There are like the Samaritans, there are hotlines you can call that won't trace your call, that respect confidentiality, that won't send police unless you
Hmm.
choose. But we don't have those options available. So it's complicated
Hmm.
because it's hard to critique a system if we don't have an alternative in place. And it's also complicated because, there are some people who like, hey, Will, I was feeling really scared. I'm really terrible. I
Hmm.
called, they came, they took me to the hospital. I got a rest. I had a good experience. Great. I'm really glad you had a positive experience. Don't silence those of us who had a horrifically violent experience,
Hmm.
and don't block us from creating an alternative. Because I mean, if you have an airline where 1,000 people a year arrive safely, but five or six, fall off the plane and get killed, you wouldn't say that's a functioning airline. You would say
Hmm.
that's a moral emergency,
Hmm.
right? You would
Hmm.
say it's a moral emergency unless you're dealing with those people, unless you're dealing with those crazy people, those
Hmm.
psychotic people, those not quite people lose their humanity when we have this attitude of diagnosis and othering, and you're somehow broken, your brain is broken, your genes are
Hmm.
broken. And then once you've lost your humanity, then the double standard comes in. And then the
Hmm.
door is open to horrific violence. I mean, there has never been a reckoning with all the LGBTQ people who were tortured and killed. There's starting to be stories that come out. I mean, Alan
Hmm.
Turing,
Hmm.
brilliant scientist, gay, tortured and murdered by
Hmm.
psychiatry.
Oh my
There's
gosh.
starting to be the stories are starting to come
Hmm.
out and be
Hmm.
recognized. There's no memorial. There's
Hmm.
certainly no financial settlement. I mean, not only should you get that 10,000 back, but you should get a major settlement for the violence that was inflicted on you,
Hmm.
as should all survivors. So we are very, very far from, but again, if you're living in a situation, if we're living in like 1800 in the United States, slavery is a moral emergency. It doesn't matter how far we are from solving it.
Mm-hmm.
It's a moral emergency, and we have to put our eyes
Mm-hmm.
on the solution. There has to be I'm an abolitionist. I don't think there's any grounds. This is supported by international law. There's
Mm-hmm.
no grounds to deny somebody any of their rights the way that you were denied and I was
Mm-hmm.
denied
Mm-hmm.
just by virtue of, oh, I'm labeling you suicidal. Oh,
Suicidal.
I'm labeling you psychotic. Oh, I'm
Mm-hmm.
labeling you in an altered states, um, in an altered state. So so thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for telling that
Mm-hmm.
story. And I hope that the listeners can understand that it's illustrative of many, many people. Why don't you hear it? Well, I mean, you're starting to. I mean, the story with read
Yeah.
Britney Spears' story. Find out what's going on with Britney Spears, who was basically human trafficked by the music industry
You
for
know, I don't know
as
that much
a
about her
psychic.
story. I don't know what.
She was a
Yeah.
slave. She was a human trafficked slave by the music industry, people extracting hundreds of millions of dollars using psychiatric diagnosis.
Mm.
That's what they use psychiatric diagnosis. They use this double standard system of once you have a diagnosis, now we can put you under conservatorship. And then
Mm.
very clever, very manipulative people were able to move in and put her in this position. And fortunately, she fought back, and she's a very high profile. A lot of people, of course, are still in her situation and don't get. I mean, historically, psychiatry has been used when there's the estate,
Mm.
when the grandfather dies and is going to divide the money to all the children. Well, actually, we're not going to give it to this child, because that's the crazy one. Let's go lock
Mhm.
her up. Um, or the abuse survivor, the daughter is saying that her father raped her. Oh no, she's crazy. She's borderline.
Mhm.
Let's just lock her up. And historically, psychiatry has been used as a tool of social
Mhm.
control, primarily to enforce the power of men over women. But it's a whole system of power and abuse that stays in place. So I'm an abolitionist, and I think the science is on our side, the law is on our side. There are many alternatives. There's so many different ways. If your ex or your husband calls for help, there's so many better ways that they could have responded
Mhm.
to you. So many better ways that and
Mhm.
these alternatives have been tested. They're in practice, but they're very small, and we don't hear about them because they challenge. There's a huge power system. There's the pharmaceutical industry. This is a pipeline to lifelong drug consumers. There's the hospital industry, the insurance industry, the whole healthcare management system that we have, the research industry, the psychiatrists that stake their careers on this. We're up against an incredible political monolith.
Mhm.
And so my hope is that people who are questioning a lot of the things that are going on in society. I mean, some of the experience with the vaccine and COVID and the questioning that's come up around that, I think is really healthy. And we're kind of unearthing that
Mhm.
we're living in a society that this is not really a democracy. It's not a democracy for many, many reasons. And this tyranny that happens around psychiatry is part of a larger tyranny. And I hope that
Mhm.
if we can connect these dots and start to think for ourselves, we can start to really make some big changes. And I think abolition should absolutely be on the table
Mhm.
for the larger, medical freedom movement, for example.
Yeah.
Our bodies should be our bodies to decide,
Mhm.
even if we, have questions about, is this really safe and effective, this Pfizer, Moderna, Johnson and Johnson thing you want to inject in me. My body is for me to decide, even if you're telling me that I'm psychotic and have a thought disorder, or I'm borderline, or no, it's a fundamental right that there's
Mhm.
no double standard here. It's a fundamental right.
Yeah, I think that like you said, there's so many dots to connect here, and I think that the bureaucratization and how everything's becoming so much more technocratic, it's missing
Mhm.
something spiritual in human connection completely. And
Yeah.
it essentially ends up dehumanizing the people
Yeah.
that the state
Yeah.
tries to control through these methods. And I think that
Yeah.
you've made that point really well in a couple of several different ways. And one of them, um, I the when you talk about how other cultures or in the past people would have perceived altered states, and now we think of them in this one way. This is
Hmm.
psychosis, this is schizophrenia, and it's kind of this albatross that gets hung around your neck that you'll never be able to be free
Hmm.
of. Um, you are a person that the state sees as less valid and less with less resources and less access to your own agency and resources from here
Hmm.
on out. And I think that that really is um, that's a tremendous problem. I have that's another vignette that I was thinking I'd share with you,
Yeah,
just
please.
to relate to what you're saying. And about 2 years ago, I had something that I experienced as a very profound spiritual experience.
Mm,
It was
mm,
about 3 hours long, and I
mm,
wasn't hearing or seeing anything, so I had no auditory or visual hallucinations, but I had a very rich internal experience of
mm,
receiving. And
mm, mm,
it was very profound. It was absolutely life-changing. And
mm,
it continued, I felt echoes of it for probably about 6 months after. It was also
mm.
scary to me. It scared me quite a lot.
Uh-huh.
And
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
in that time when I was going through it, when I was in that experience, I called my dad and he talked with me and we talked through it. We had this really wonderful conversation. And but I needed someone to talk to
Yeah.
because I was really scared about what was
Yeah.
happening.
Yeah. Yeah.
It
Yeah.
it was very beautiful. It was very profound, but it shattered my paradigm of life, and it changed
Mm.
it forever. I have not
Wow.
gone back to seeing things the way that I saw them before, although I've gone somewhat back. I thought about this afterwards. I considered it a spiritual experience. I said it was almost a psychedelic experience, although I was sober. But I'm trained in psychiatric diagnosis, and I knew also that this was technically psychosis. I technically went through, if you wanted to look at it from that lens, a psychotic episode. And that is really just if you look at it from that angle
Mhm,
versus
mhm,
looking at it as
mhm.
a profound spiritual, what a difference in perspective
Yeah.
about what
Yeah.
a person has gone through. What a difference in my own
Mm.
perspective about what one side has shame attached to it. Like, wow,
Yes.
I better not tell anybody
Mhm.
about that because they'll think I'm crazy. And the other side has this incredible richness and offering of insight and new ways of thinking. And so,
Can I ask you
it's
to,
super interesting.
can you say a little bit more about the state? Like what was in there that you experienced inside of you that changed was it like what was it like? Yeah. Can you say more about it? I'm really curious about it.
Oh, sure. Yeah, it was like realizations, and there was imagery, but it wasn't
Mm,
it wasn't splayed out in front of me in some kind of a, like I said, I didn't experience a visual hallucination
mhm,
or alterations of the my vision around
mhm,
me, but I received a lot of very rich imagery. And one of the pictures in my mind was this moving picture of sort of a fractal, almost, this is why I said it was kind of like a psychedelic experience,
psychedelic. Uh-huh.
sort of like a fractal of life spiraling off of life and us
Oh.
spiraling
Mm,
out of, and there were aftershocks of this that lasted me a long time. I could still call it up and receive it.
mm,
And I had all of these connections about how we inhabit different forms and patterns throughout our own
mm,
existence, and
mm,
how God is rooted in all of us, how we're all rooted in God, and we're
mm.
all a part of
Beautiful.
something. And it was so very
Beautiful.
real. It wasn't like just words in a religious text. It was the way that I experienced it was like, this is you're getting to glimpse what I felt was the loneliness of the one, and the reason for the reason that we are many is in order to experience connection with one another, because
Beautiful.
to be just
Huh.
one is so profoundly lonely. And so
Yeah.
the reason for our existence is that we have the opportunity to experience the separation that gives us the chance to come back towards connection and the joy of
Beautiful.
connection. So
Beautiful.
it was really beautiful,
That's
but
great.
the loneliness of the one
I'm
was
so
this,
happy for you. That's really beautiful.
it was super
Yeah.
beautiful.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
really wonderful.
Yeah. So
I mean,
that's
you
kind
had
of
an
the
experience
experience.
you had an experience that Jung would call self experience. You contacted the divine whole kind of perfection of being part of the connected cosmos that
Mm-hmm.
is all of us, really. And yeah, you had the wisdom or the caution or the self-protection to go to a safe person,
Mm-hmm.
because if you had gone to someone and they notice your fear, then they get afraid. What a lot of people say is that the response of the other, if the other is welcoming and warm and like, oh, tell me about your altered
Mm-hmm.
state, it goes one. But if the other person's like, oh, they get scared,
Mm-hmm.
and they're afraid, now you're more afraid. And then this
Right.
feedback, and then it can very quickly spiral into, well, we need to get you. And then there are so many people who have had just absolutely genuine spiritual experiences that, because they're maybe caught up in, or they're also tangled up with some fear, maybe some trauma history and stress in their life, it can lead them right into the psychiatric system. The
Mm-hmm.
spiritual side is absolutely suppressed and forgotten and never talked about. And it's all about, you have a manic episode, you're bipolar, you're schizophrenic, and then the person can be in the system 5, 10, 15, 20, and then eventually, hopefully, they start to get some kind of support, or they start to get a different, but a lot of people don't. They
Mm-hmm.
go right down, and then they're destroyed
Mm-hmm.
by the system. So many of the people that I work with feel that sense of liberation, of finally having the spiritual side of what's been called psychosis validated, explored. Some people just turn away from it, like, oh, it's too scary, it got me into the hospital. Well, okay, let's figure out how you can regain some of that part of yourself, but in a safe way. Let's do it slowly. Let's figure out what got you into the hospital and work on
Mm-hmm.
that part. But let's not give up on the spiritual side of yourself just because it's been pathologized, or
Mm-hmm.
you're told it was just like these were just hallucinations, or because like those energies were too intense
Mm-hmm.
and they led you into the hospital. Let's help you, because we're talking about some of the most important things that there is. Contacting God. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
what would be more important than to help somebody work through that? But
Mm-hmm.
psychiatry, which is actually the most God despising of all the
Mm-hmm.
professions, like there's I think a higher rate of atheists
Oh,
identified as
wow.
psychiatrists
That's
than
really
any medical
interesting.
profession. Yeah, they have contempt. They have contempt. I mean, maybe they might say, well, okay, if you're from Haiti, or you're from Brazil, or you're from some country where, but you're not. So all this is just, fanciful misfirings of your neurotransmitter synapses or something.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Wow. I
But
had
yeah.
never thought about it that way, but that's really interesting. I can certainly see that. If it can't be explained and administered and experienced in this really rigid, systematic way, then there's no room
Yeah.
for it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, part of it is that we just don't have spaces. Like a
Mm-hmm.
lot of the people that I work with, they just need like a room
Mm-hmm.
and some food and just be left alone for a while.
Mm-hmm.
But they're tangled up with their families. They have nowhere to go.
Mm-hmm.
They're in a crowded apartment where if they make noises, they get into trouble with the landlord. I mean, there's no space. Where can you go to not work
Mm-hmm.
in society? There used to be spaces where like, oh, this is the family, and so, like, oh, he's not working. He's a young guy. He sort of doesn't really say much, but he's around.
Mm-hmm.
You could, if you talk to him, he's kind of like weird. But he's around. He's part of the family. We're not like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, someone is now isolating and withdrawn. We have to put them into a hospital and we have to get them. There's no space for diversity of human experience. There's no space for just letting people kind of be. And I
Mm-hmm.
interviewed a colleague who, she passed away recently, but a rights activist in India. And she said this is one of the functions of a lot of the temples, is that people who are in those states, they maybe might not be able to feed themselves. They may be really, really, but they can go to temples and people recognize there's a holy spiritual aspect to what they're going through. And they provide for them,
Mm-hmm.
they give them food, they give them a place to be, and they give them the space to go through what they're going through. And maybe they connect them with a religious leader who can help
Mm-hmm.
guide them. Um, there are a number of there's a number of research studies about the way in which, like, I think this was in uh, in Madagascar, I'm not remembering the details. I may have this a little bit wrong in the country, but basically the experience of being possessed by demons, of being possessed by jinn,
Mm-hmm.
is recognized in Islamic culture as just being something that happens.
Mm-hmm.
And so people who would be diagnosed with schizophrenia, if they just went a few countries away to a
Mm-hmm.
cosmopolitan area, in that culture, they're like, oh, you're possessed by jinn, and we're not going to exile you. We're not going to banish you. You're going to be part of, we're not going to tell you that you're never going to get better,
Mm-hmm.
because that is the self-fulfilling prophecy of like, I was told, oh no, this is a genetic,
Yeah.
you're always going to have this. Just manage your
Right.
symptoms with medication. The expectation that someone is going to get better helps someone get better. I mean, having
Yeah.
that expectations. And so the way in which they're not pathologized, they're given a system, a structure of meaning. People aren't afraid of them. Basically, they would be schizophrenic in a different culture, but because they're in a traditional Islamic culture, there's a whole framework. They actually recover at much higher rates. They actually get back into
Mm-hmm.
connection with life, even though they're as dysfunctional, as dropped out of society as someone that we would call a chronic schizophrenic. So we need to learn, because we spend a lot of time fearing people, giving them self-fulfilling prophecies of, it's gonna turn out bad. We don't expect you to get better. We've given up on people. There's research. I mean, not everybody gets better. I mean, that's the reality. Some people seem to stay in their states and they don't. A lot of people do get better. There's been research. How do we figure out? How do we figure out who the people who are just going to keep, struggling, and who are the people who are going to get out and thrive? There's no way to tell. There's no way to tell. So you have to treat everyone as if they can get out. Everyone I meet, severe or extreme or difficult, however distressing or chaotic the family is, how many hospitalizations, how many around the merry-go-round they've gone. I always have an attitude, which I think is an evidence-based, truthful, honest attitude of, yeah, you can get through this. I was on disability check for 15 years.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if the research is there, but the number of people with a schizophrenia diagnosis
Mm-hmm.
who've been on disability for 15 years who then get off of it is very, very, very small. And it was because to surround people who weren't telling me, no, you can't. Sure, you can get out of this. You can find a way back
Mm-hmm.
into society. So the other thing I want to mention, Leslie, that we didn't talk about is, what is it that drives a state, and
Mm-hmm.
respecting and honoring and responding well. If there's one thing that I want people to learn about these altered states, is the connection with sleep.
Mm-hmm.
So someone goes into, like in your story, maybe you weren't sleeping. That might have been part of what was going on. I would imagine that you were having a difficulty sleeping when you went into that suicidal state, with all the stress with the two kids and then the betrayal
Mm-hmm.
by your partner. And that's a very common thing, because anybody listening to this podcast, if you don't sleep, you're going to go into an altered state. You're going to hear voices, you're going to have visions, you're going to go, whatever it's going to be for you. So sleep, going into an altered state, is a normal response to stress. Sleep being one of the biggest stressors. So sometimes people need to go into an altered state. Maybe it's a way of escaping a situation. Maybe there's gifts in there. But ideally, I would like people to have a sense of choice and control, so that if you want to be off medications, if you want to be in the workplace and you don't want to go into an altered state, or maybe not as deep
Mm-hmm.
as you did then you want to look at things like sleep. And we don't educate people in sleep hygiene. We just give them lithium. Oh, you're manic, you're bipolar, your brain is broken, you need lithium forever. Lithium is an extremely toxic drug. They don't do blood draws on lithium just to see what the levels are. They do it to keep it within a window that's not going to kill you.
Mm-hmm.
And it's different for each person. The blood levels can change. So if one thing that your listeners could think about when they look at altered states in themselves or people in their lives, or how we can change our response, it's looking at sleep and how sleep deprivation can drive these states. I work with people a lot who are just kind of learning how to do what we all do, which is we take care of ourselves. They learn how to take care of themselves a little bit better, slowly, trial and error. to help maybe prevent some of the, I still go into altered states. Um, I still go into suicidal feelings states. I still get very withdrawn. I hear voices. I have very difficult altered states. But I understand it. I have a different relationship to it.
Mhm.
Sleep is something that I pay a lot of attention to.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I think that's a really important thing to highlight the connection
Mhm.
between our foundations of health and how our body is being taken care of and how and the mental and spiritual manifestations or the perceptions of reality that
Yeah.
we'll experience and I really what you when you're talking about the possession I think that's
Yeah.
it's so interesting how different that is because that's something that doesn't pathologize the human being. It just says, here's a thing that you're going through. We have a way to help
Yeah.
versus the
Yeah.
life sentence that some of these diagnoses, these medical mental health diagnoses carry with
Mhm.
them. You are never
Mhm.
going to get better. You are a schizophrenic now. You are a crazy person. And so,
Yeah.
it's really, it's quite fascinating to just look at the paradigm difference between one culture's
Mhm.
approach and another culture's approach, and how we don't
Mhm.
necessarily
Mhm.
have to do it this way just because this is how we do it.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And there's a big movement. I mean, it's not as big as I would like it to be, but there's a psychiatric survivor movement. There's a critical psychiatry movement. There's websites like Mad in America. There are psychiatrists, nurses, psychotherapists, social workers, psychologists that are involved with groups like the International Society for the Psychological Study of Psychosis, ISPS, the Critical Psychiatry Network. The important thing is if you share these perspectives, if you have a critical view, to not be isolated, to connect with other professionals, other family members, other patients. And there's a lot going on online. There's different groups. There are groups that help people make better decisions about medications. There's help for people coming off. There are groups now of suicidal feelings support where they don't just assess you and then call the police. There are peer supporters that you can connect with, alternatives to therapists, alternatives to doctors. So there is a movement that's happening, but
Mhm.
we're up against the power of pharma. We're up against ultimately the military industrial complex, the kind of corporate fascism that we have in the United States that is deeply anti-democratic. And we're going to have to get organized. We're going to have to start speaking up and saying we want an alternative. We want something. We don't just want more money for mental health. That's, people have mental health problems for a reason. We're in a
Mhm.
crazy society. This is a crazy culture that we're in. Why don't we start fixing some of the social determinants of
Mhm.
mental health rather than just profiteering off of the symptoms
Mhm.
by providing disease management and, forced hospitalization that you bill somebody for $10,000 for.
Yeah, absolutely. What are some resources that you would recommend to people, and where can people find your work?
Yeah, so Mad in America is a great place to start. My website is willhall.net. Madness Radio is my podcast. It's on a number of different podcasting platforms. I have a book, Outside Mental Health, that you can buy from your local independent bookseller. There's also a free ebook version of it that you can get a hold of. Um, let's see. I mean, once you start to kind of break through the mainstream media narrative, there's a rich, rich tradition, many organizations, many um, thinkers, many books, many efforts, many different kinds of activist campaigns that are going on. There's a whole rich world community of people thinking about these issues that I encourage people to find out about and get involved with. And because again, it's the divide and conquer and the isolation. That's what makes us powerless. And community and connection and joining together and raising our voices. I mean, Leslie, I'm just really grateful that you have told your story, in this public context. And that, I mean, it's not, took me a long time to reach a point when I was ready. But when you are ready, it's just like the gay liberation movement coming out and saying there's nothing wrong with me. I
Mm,
deserve equal rights. Stop violating me. That's fun. That's the heart of any social movement, is speaking truth to power, speaking from
mm,
your heart. People who've been oppressed, who've been violated, standing up. It takes a tremendous amount of courage, but the more people that can do it, I think the stronger our, and it's happening. I mean, the Britney Spears victory, if you don't know about that,
mm.
read about it.
I
It's
guess I
pretty,
need to learn.
yeah, there's
Yeah.
it's a very instructional. I mean, the media is kind of spinning it as though the bad family did this thing, but it was a whole industry, and the power of psychiatry
Mm,
to create this double standard
mm.
is repeated over and over and over again. So,
Well, I'm really grateful that you took the time to talk with me today, and I've been looking forward to this conversation. I really enjoy and can't recommend enough your podcast because I think the conversations are they're so exploratory and open and yet gentle and nuanced. And I think that it's a really great resource. And I love that you're drawing attention to this issue the way that you are. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me.
thank you, Leslie. I really appreciate the invitation. So we're just adding in this little supplemental part of the story that I wanted to make sure that the listeners hear. Can you tell us what happened after you got the bill for the
Yeah,
$10,000 for getting locked
sure.
up?
So I got the bill a couple of months after, I think. I think it was a little while after, like you do with hospital bills. Sometimes they trickle in. I got this bill. It was around $10,000. And I was livid. And I wrote an account of what had happened and and I attached it to a strongly worded letter to the hospital. And I told them that if they ever sent me another bill, it was going straight in the trash. I think I also copied it to the King County Sheriff's Department. I was
Great,
working with a
great,
therapist at the time, and she was really, really helpful to me because this was so hard. This
great.
going through what had happened, I was
Mm.
untangling it, and I never received another bill, and it never showed up on my credit. So
That's
I think that they
fantastic.
disappeared it. I think they disappeared it because I think that
Great.
they knew that they were in the wrong.
The power of standing up to the bully. Good for
Yeah,
you.
yeah. So you thought that was an important thing to add
I thought
in.
that was an important part to add in. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank
Well,
you.
that's what happened. So I do encourage people not to get discouraged um and and be quiet just because they're afraid of the system. I mean, keep pushing. And
Yeah. Right
yeah,
on.
yeah. Well, thank you so much, Will.